the main driving force for Scottish independence, has faced scandals and political instability. The Scottish National Party is expected to lose seats in the upcoming UK general election. So, is the dream of an independent Scotland now dead? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, independence movements in Europe appear to be losing steam. Nationalists in Catalonia came second and third in a recent election. Polls in Scotland suggest SNP candidates will lose seats. Is the appetite for Scottish independence drying up?
SNP leader Humza Yousaf resigning after a year in the top job.
Independence feels frustratingly close, but the last few miles of the marathon are always the hardest. And we have run this race as a team, and I now will prepare to pass the baton to successor, who I'm absolutely certain will lead us over the finish line.
But is this true? The Scottish National Party has had a difficult year and a half, to say the least. February 2023, the then very popular leader Nicola Sturgeon unexpectedly resigns, saying she feels it is time to go. A week later, her husband, Peter Morrell, resigns as SNP chief executive over misleading the media about party membership numbers. 11 days later, Humza Yousaf becomes the new leader. On April 5th of last year, Peter Morrell is arrested over party financial irregularities. A year later, he is re-arrested and charged with embezzlement of SNP funds. Morrell has not commented publicly on the charge. 10 days later, Humza Yousaf resigns after a power-sharing agreement with the Green Party falls apart.
Recently, these positions have been shifting so much across all of the governments that, particularly in the light of, or in the run-up to a lot of significant elections, it doesn't feel like it really inspires much faith in many of these leaders.
There are other important issues, like long waiting times to see a doctor or the cost of living, that might trump independence, at least for the moment. There have been times when polls showed those saying yes to independence were more than the no's. But at the moment, 44% are in favour of independence, 49% are not, and 7% don't know. On July 4th, the UK will go to the polls in a general election. Scottish voters will decide who to send to Westminster. It's likely SNP will drop from the current 43 seats. If that is the case, what does it say about the desire for a Scottish sovereign nation and Scotland's position within the Union?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Edinburgh is Colin Fox. He is the national spokesperson of the Scottish Socialist Party and a leading independence campaigner. And in Glasgow, in Scotland, we have Sir John Curtice. He is a political scientist and professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde. You're both very welcome to Roundtable. Sir John, I'll come to you first of all. What does the polling tell us at the moment in Scotland about the issue of independence?
Well, the truth is that if you ask people how they would vote if there were another independence referendum, the country proves to be almost evenly divided. On average, the polls, really ever since 2019, for the last 4 or 5 years now, have been saying around 49% of people say they would vote yes, and just over 50% say they would vote no. So there's probably a small majority for the Union, but a very small one indeed. And I think the honest truth is, if we were to have another referendum anytime soon, nobody could be sure what the outcome would be.
Sir John, I always see in the polls about Scottish independence, there's always about 7 or 8% of people who don't have an opinion or don't know. How can you not have formed an opinion on something as absolutely vital to Scottish life and the future of Scotland as independence?
Well, of course, the truth is there are always some people who want to opt out of any political argument. But for the most part, the truth is that Scotland is pretty engaged on this subject. Certainly the evidence of the 2014 independence referendum, when 85% of people turned out to vote, made it very clear that for most people on both sides of the argument, this is a crucial issue. Indeed, that 85% figure is the highest level of turnout that we've had in Scotland in any election or referendum since the introduction of the mass franchise back after the First World War.
Colin, I see the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, is saying that this UK general election coming up on July the 4th will be the election that finally sees off the Scottish independence movement. Is he right?
No, he's not right. I mean, Scotland could do with some more comedians. I suspect Douglas Ross is hoping that this election, I'm probably going to see that this election on the 4th of July will see off 14 years of Conservative government. That's probably truer to say than his remarks about independence. I mean, the debate on independence is all about context. I think John's figures there are absolutely remarkable. 48% of the population of Scotland, 10 years after the referendum, are in favour of independence. It's truly remarkable, isn't it? I mean, it's against the background where, I'm sure we'll cover it, the SNP support is down to 30%, but support for independence is actually up 3% from where we were at the referendum 10 years ago. That's astonishing.
It's a very interesting point, Colin. Yeah, absolutely. So tell me what's gone wrong with the SNP. So people in Scotland, almost half want independence, but the SNP vote has come down.
Yeah, it's complicated. Two simple factors are that a lot of people who support independence are going to be voting Labour, believe it or not, on the 4th of July, because the issue in this general election is we want to get rid of the Tories. That's it. We've had 14 years of this government. 5 Conservative prime ministers in that period of time, scandal after scandal. People are sick to the back teeth of the Conservatives and they're going to get hammered. So in Scotland, a lot of independent supporters want to be in the winning side. They want to be voting Labour, despite the fact that Labour doesn't support independence. That's one side of it. And the other side of it is a third, it used to be the case, about a third of SNP supporters, believe it or not, didn't support independence. They supported the SNP's alleged efficiency at Holyrood or the way they run things, or Nicola Sturgeon was temporarily possible. Of course, that's all changed now. And the SNP have been in power here in Scotland for an awful long time. And too many of our public services that they're responsible for are in a poor old state.
Sir John, give us your reading of the kind of reduction in public support for the SNP then, because their polling numbers are going backwards.
It really stems from the decision of Nicola Sturgeon back in February of last year to resign as SNP leader. When she made that decision, or announced that decision, the SNP was still running at 43% in the polls, just a couple of points down on what they got in 2019. But by the time that election was over, and it was a divisive election contest in which there were some sharp barbs between Humza Yousaf, the eventual victor, and Kate Forbes, his principal challenger, by the end of that contest, support for the SNP was already 5 points down. And the truth is that Humza Yousaf was not a relatively particularly popular successor, certainly much less popular than Nicola Sturgeon. And then, of course, he had the misfortune not long after becoming leader that the police investigation into allegations about the management of the SNP's finances, these produced their first arrest in the form of Peter Murrell, Nicola Sturgeon's husband. Now, that in itself didn't have much impact, but the subsequent arrest of Nicola Sturgeon herself, although she was released and has not since been charged, that did result in some decline in SNP support. And the problem for the SNP is that actually before all of these events, support for Labour north of the border had already risen quite substantially for much the same reasons that support had risen for Labour south of the border. That is, 1, Boris Johnson in Partygate, and 2, Liz Truss and her fiscal event. So when the SNP began to hit political trouble, they were doing so at a time when Labour were in a position to challenge, having effectively squeezed the unionist vote, much of it away from the Conservatives. More recently, of course, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, Humza Yousaf ended the Bute House agreement with the Scottish Greens. There had been a lot of discontent within his party about that. But that set in train a trail of events, which first of all led to Mr. Yousaf resigning, his replacement indeed with John Swinney, his successor. But that political turmoil, much like some of the turmoil that's affected the Conservatives during this current Westminster Parliament. That turmoil saw the SNP actually fall behind the Labour Party in voting intentions in Scotland for the first time. They're about 5 or 6 points ahead. And the putting John Swinney in his lead on its own, at least, has not been enough to stem the tide. So the SNP have their political difficulties. Colin is also right to point to the fact that their record in office is also not regarded that highly. And crucially now, whereas until hitherto, many people who believed in independence but were doubtful about the SNP's record in office were willing to forget the latter and were focusing on the former. That, given the SNP's internal turmoil, is no longer the case.
Colin, tell us a bit about John Swinney, the new leader of the SNP, Scotland's new First Minister.
Yes, well, I'd say, just taking on from John's point, it answers your question, and that is the dichotomy between the SNP's 30% and support for independence 48%. And a partial explanation that also comes from the fact that a lot of people, including myself, who are independent supporters, lost confidence in the ability of the SNP to bring forward a strategy for achieving it. We lost a great deal of confidence in Nicola Sturgeon's traipsing down to the Supreme Court on a whim and a silly exercise like that, rather than concentrating on her day job, which was to explain to the people of Scotland why independence would make them better off economically, socially, politically, culturally. And actually that task now passes on to John Swinney. And I think John Swinney, he's considered Janitor John. He said when he was elected as the SNP leader a week past that he wasn't a caretaker. He wasn't a caretaker leader and he wasn't a caretaker First Minister. I have to say, if in 4 weeks' time the SNP loses half their seats in Scotland, as John Curtice and others predict, then there'll be very serious questions for John Swinney to ask. And whether or not he falls on his sword, well, I don't know, because he's not been in very long, but he's considered Janitor John as far as that's concerned. And I don't think John Swinney inspires much confidence in the wider independence movement that he's going to come forward with that strategy that we're looking for to take us from 48% to the 60% we need to press the button and push for independence.
Sir John, I've heard criticism levelled at the SNP that when you've got a party that has one sole key core policy at its heart and leaders who wake up every day and that is their sole focus, independence, that perhaps they take the eye off the ball in terms of National Health Service, the economy, other issues that maybe matter a bit more to the working man and woman?
Well, that is a criticism that is often voiced by unionists, but you will note that when they voice that criticism, unionists demonstrate at least as much a focus and concentration on the constitutional question as do those who criticise. Actually, it is ironically, it's the Conservative Party in Scotland who talk most of all about the constitutional question because they believe passionately in defence of the union. Certainly, however, after 14 years in office, and given, frankly, the very difficult situation that all governments across the UK have faced in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the subsequent cost of living crisis, the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war on the supply of energy, the inflationary spiral we have had. Governments in London, Cardiff and Edinburgh have struggled to cope with this, particularly with respect to the public services. Waiting times in England are at record high, waiting times in Wales are at a record high, and waiting times in Edinburgh at a record high. But the truth is, when you're in government, if you happen to be in place when the music stops and you don't have a chair to sit on, then you are going to be in political trouble. And one of the reasons why the Labour Party are popular at the moment is that the line they are pursuing in Scotland is to say, you're unhappy with London and the Conservatives, you're unhappy with the SNP administration in Edinburgh, therefore vote for us in order to express your discontent with both of them. And I think the truth is that that line of argument is proving to be somewhat attractive to voters in Scotland who, seeing the difficulties that their country faces, not uniquely, true across the UK, but seeing the different difficulties they faces, are looking for some kind of alternative. And Labour are able to profit from that zeitgeist.
Colin, it's often said that Scotland can't afford to go it alone. My reading of it would be that London and Westminster can't actually afford to lose Scotland, all that North Sea oil and gas money.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the past, this debate about Scotland had to prove it could exist as a modern, democratic, industrialised country. And we could point to the oil and gas in the North Sea. We could point to these vast potential renewable energy deposits that we have. We could point to industries, farming and food and the world-class universities we have. And we continue to do that, and we should do that as part of the independence movement. But inevitably, you're forced to make a choice, aren't you? And you look at those who argue that Scotland couldn't be independent, they're actually counterposing the status quo, aren't they? The status quo where in Britain, we've just seen scandal, the blood product scandal. We've just seen the Horizon scandal. We had Bloody Sunday as another scandal. Hillsborough is another scandal. And the truth of the matter is, it's the UK setup, the United Kingdom, that's unstable, that's past its best, that needs to answer these questions about what kind of future are they offering people. And John quite rightly talks about this feeling that people, Labour's message is that you're unhappy with the SNP and unhappy with the Tories, therefore vote Labour. My prediction is, since Labour have got nothing whatsoever to offer to the crisis in the NHS, the crisis in social care provision, the crisis in dental health provision, all these crises are in Keir Starmer's entry, and he brings forward no proposal that's worth a damn. And my suspicion is within 2 years, Labour will be as unpopular as the Tories. And that leads to the whole scenario, the whole paradigm changes, where in Scotland, people have got an escape hatch from that. And that's the national question. That's where I expect the support for independence to rise from 48 or 50% just now to 60% in the backs of a failed Labour government, because that's what we're going to get after the 4th of July.
Sir John, if we look ahead then, do you think that is likely to happen, that under a future premiership of Sir Keir Starmer, if we believe all the polling, he becomes British Prime Minister 2-3 years down the line? Do you think he would offer Scotland another referendum?
There is no prospect of Sir Keir Starmer offering Scotland another referendum if we have a majority Labour government. The truth is that for all the sound and fury that we've had north of the border about whether or not the SNP would or would not regard the next election as a de facto referendum, etc., the realpolitik of the situation is that the only way that Scotland is going to get an independence referendum anytime soon is if we end up with a hung parliament during which the SNP have sufficient leverage over a minority Labour administration that Sir Keir Starmer, faced with the choice between having to go to the country because he's at risk of losing a vote of no confidence or holding a Scottish independence referendum, decides that the latter course of action is the better course. And indeed, the fundamental reason why Scottish independence is currently off the political agenda actually goes back to the Liz Truss fiscal event. It's the Liz Truss fiscal event that opened up for the first time the prospect of a majority Labour government as opposed to the prospect of a minority Labour government, which was what was envisioned following Partygate. It's that fiscal event and that reaction of the public to Liz Truss that has made life so difficult for the SNP subsequently. That said, one thing I would agree with Colin, I think the failure of the last 6 months of Nicola Sturgeon's tenure as First Minister, she didn't succeed in getting the debate about independence going in the post-COVID environment, which is what they were wanting to do. And it's worth remembering Scotland does now need to have a new debate about independence. I mean, whatever your views about the economics of independence, the question that now faces Scotland is not the same question that it faced in 2014. In 2014, it was simply a question about whether you want to be inside or outside the UK, with both sides arguing that Scotland would remain inside the European Union, albeit there was a dispute about that. But now, given that the UK has left the European Union, the question that Scotland now faces is whether or not it wants to be inside the UK but outside the EU, or inside the EU but outside the UK. And although it's clear there are still doubts amongst many voters in Scotland about the economics of independence, when you ask them to start thinking about that choice because they are even more sceptical about Brexit than they are doubtful about independence, then you discover that actually people are more inclined to feel that being inside the EU but outside the UK might be the better option. But that's not really the debate we've had north of the border. It's the debate the SNP have not managed to get kick-started. How the public in Scotland will feel when we have that debate, and there are going to be some quite nuanced arguments on both sides, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly now, the debate in Scotland is no longer simply about independence, it's about Brexit and independence combined.
Colin, that's a very good point, isn't it? Young people in Scotland must be feeling very angry about being dragged out of the European Union against their wishes.
Well, and let me say this, if you forgive my impudence, I want to agree with Professor John and then disagree with him. I agree with you entirely about the new question. There's so much has changed in 2 years. The decline of the UK, United Kingdom's continued. I agree that Keir Starmer will never agree to a second referendum. But where I disagree with Professor Curtice is that if Scotland gets 60% support and can sustain it over a prolonged period of time, it's a very unwise politician, Keir Starmer and others included, who would seek to defy the democratic wishes of the population of a country if it wants to have independence. Very unwise indeed. Even if he has a massive majority at Westminster and House of Commons, he's not going to turn round and hold the line which says Scotland can't have what it wants. That wouldn't happen here. It wouldn't happen in Ireland. It wouldn't happen anywhere else. So my attitude is, if we can convince the people of Scotland of the case for independence, and I'd be the first to accept that there's a lot of work to be done, the economic case presented so far is not good enough. The strategy presented for achieving it, not good enough. The independence organisation in Scotland currently, not good enough. But if we address those and we get to a position where 60% plus of the people of Scotland, and a sustained polling by Professor Curtice and his colleagues, continuously say that they want an independent country, the right to self-determination, then it would be unwise, if I can put it mildly, of Keir Starmer and anybody else to try and hold that back, because they would not succeed. And you could read into that what you like, whether it's parliamentary action or extra parliamentary action that's necessary. That will not be tolerated.
What do you say to that, Sir John?
That people across the world can see.
Well, first of all, I would agree with Colin that the crucial thing that those on the yes side need to do is they do need to increase support for independence to well above where it currently stands. And one advantage to them, well, there are two advantages to them if they can actually achieve that. One is that actually, particularly business, but other organisations will begin to accommodate themselves to the possibility that Scotland might become independent, and that therefore actually fighting a referendum campaign against that backdrop will be easier, because there'll be less in the way of people saying, oh, these businesses are going to leave Scotland straight away. Businesses will already have begun to accommodate themselves to that change. The second thing that would flow from the polls beginning to put support for independence at 60% is that whereas unionists at the moment are inclined to say, look, you had your referendum 10 years ago, you said it would be once in a generation event, you're not having another one. And not wanting to get engaged in the debate, unionists would have to start to fight to their corner, and we would start to have the debate. That said, however, when that debate might actually force another referendum, well, that's another matter. Colin may be right that politicians will be unwise to try to stand in the way, but I think in the short term, at least, the politicians, they would probably now start to engage in the debate, but they would not necessarily want to reckon that they are going to lose that debate until they've tried pretty hard to try to avoid that referendum.
Colin, do you think you'll see an independent Scotland in your lifetime?
Yes, Enda, because I'm a young guy, very young. But I tell you what struck me ironic. Keir Starmer is in this election using the word change. Change, this is about change. This election is all about change. The irony is, that's the one thing that Keir Starmer won't do. There is no prospect of fundamental change under Keir Starmer. This is a neoliberal economist. This is somebody who stands by the United Kingdom. This is somebody who's on the wrong side of the Gaza debate, in my opinion. But to take the word change in a world which I would argue is going through a profound process of changing, the abandonment of a global, globalization, neoliberal capitalism, where you've now got free markets or protectionism, actually, the end of privatization. The irony for the independence movement is we have to draw our own conclusion about whether independence is about change or not. Is independence about change? Then you get a 60% vote. If you say to people, it's about keeping the pound, keeping the Queen, keeping neoliberal capitalism, keeping finance capital in Edinburgh in charge, you'll never get 60%. And that's where the independence movement has to resolve for itself, whether independence is actually about change or it's about just fiddling the deck chairs on the Titanic, in which case we'll never persuade the majority of people, particularly those who are looking, those in the deprived communities of Scotland, of which there are far, far too many. That's where support for independence is deepest. Those who need a change, an option of change, and are looking for hope from the future and lifting them out the misery that the United Kingdom and the cost of living crisis and all the scandals and crises that go along with it.
Final question to you, Sir John. Just on that issue of change, give us a prediction. Are we likely to see a referendum in the next 5 years?
I think at the moment the answer to that question is no, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out in the next 10 to 15 years. I think ultimately the issue is going to have to be revisited, certainly if the United Kingdom remains outside the European Union, simply because it looks as though support for independence is pretty robust. It's not as high as it needs to be to win, but it is at such a level, and given the demographic profile whereby younger people are much more in favour than older people, and I'm afraid some of the older people are no longer going to be with us in 10 years' time, it's going to be difficult to avoid in the longer run.
Sir John Curtice and Colin Fox, thank you both so much for your insight. Excellent analysis. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.